Today we're going to talk about pain. Basically, the two main subdivisions of this is what is pain at a neurological level and why does it exist. If you've taken a biology class, all of you have done some sort of cellular biology. In order to become a coach, you have to know how muscle contraction works. You've got the upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, and muscle cell picture in your brain, so you know how cells connect to each other and talk to each other. I'm going to be talking about how that works for sensory perception, specifically the focus being pain, but we'll start with light and sound, so vision and hearing, and then move on to somatosensation of like touch and heat, which is like touch proper and pain. And we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how that actually works. And then from there, we'll go into some simple neural circuitry that is not just so that you know how the neural circuitry works because it's fun, but because it actually informs like what this is for. This came out of a conversation I had with CJ after the last podcast that we did, where there's a perspective that CJ was bringing as kind of a devil's advocate, that we can't really say why pain evolved. It may not have anything to do with protecting tissue, and I'm going to make the counter argument that pain is to protect us from injury and to protect ourselves. And I'm going to use a neuroscience argument to ground that, because I think a lot of the pain discussion is taking place in a fantasy land that is unconstrained by reality. So I'm hoping to ground it a little bit, and hopefully you can take the nuts and bolts of what pain is, and so when you're reading some scientific paper or you're reading you're hearing some psychological argument, you have some context as to what the nuts and bolts of pain as a phenomenon of the nervous system is. So we're going to start off with this is I tried to limit the jargon as much as possible. This is necessary. So sensory transduction is the process of taking some kind of energy in the environment and turning that information into an electrical change in the nervous system. So this is a cartoon diagram, somebody with a nervous system, and the world around them has tastes, temperatures, tactile information, smells, sights, sounds, and that has to be transferred into a pattern that the nervous system can interpret in order to build a map of the world that you can use to navigate and exist as a biological creature. So one example is vision. So this is a example of color spectrums that vary by species. So cats and dogs and humans see different kinds of colors. This is kind of a famous example where insects and flowers are doing this cool like color coordinated dance that we can't see because our vision is limited to a smaller part of the light spectrum. The reason that this is because there are different proteins inside of the retina of different species that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light at different levels. So if you don't have a protein that does the transduction that can respond to ultraviolet, you cannot see it. This is what this process looks like. The point isn't the wiring per se, but if you look here, this is colored, so you have a green, red, and blue. The color of the cell is not the actual, if you looked at a retina, it's not like they're colored that way, but it's a diagram that light, which is just it's a electromagnetic energy, a photon, is of varying energy levels, and that's expressed in the wavelength, the frequency of the light, and that energy level will resonate with a specialized protein that will change the electrical state of a protein within a cell that will signal to the cell to change ultimately the membrane potential, meaning the voltage across the inside and outside of the cell, so that it will trigger the release of a neurotransmitter and begin a cascade where there's various sorts of simple computation that go on here. But the nuts and bolts are photon changes a thing in the cell, changes the electrical impulse of the cell, talks to eventually the brain. But depending on the activity of that cell, the activity of light on the retina, there'll be a different pattern of activity in your brain, and that's how your mind can perceive the world. So that happens not just with vision. I gave this example. This is just a visual for representation of how responsive a particular protein is to a particular wavelength of light. So the red cone is responsive to more longer wavelengths. The blue cone is responsive to shorter wavelengths of light. And if you were a different kind of creature, you could have more cones, less cones. There's like shrimp that have something like 20 different flavors of color that they can, different proteins that transduce light information. But this is the human suite, and just to visualize what that looks like in human vision. Each one of those is doing transduction. A photon, something in the world, the light coming from the kitchen, is hitting a cell that either can or cannot respond to a particular wavelength of light. Another example is hearing. So the transduction is happening with a specialized cell that will cause a change in electrical impulse in your inner ear, your organ of Corti, that little snail shell thing, by being physically pulled. So when the cell is pulled, a current comes through it, and whether or not it is pulled is dependent on where it sits in a membrane that resonates at different positions with different frequencies of sound. So high frequencies over here, low frequencies over here, and then the wiring from that strip of membrane to your brain is preserved topologically so that the high frequency, low frequency is mapped spatially in the brain, and thereby you have the information of what frequency of sound you're listening to. So with that being said, I have a question. How could people vary in their sensory perceptions? This is an actual question. Andrew, given what I just said, how would you explain if a person varies in their perception from somebody else at this level? How could that happen?
How could that happen?
Yeah. How could you perceive, say, touch differently than somebody else?
More sensitive.
Sure. You could have more
of the nerves that pick up the signal.
Perfect.
Or amplify the signal. Maybe my voltage level is higher.
Yep. You could have somewhere in that transduction or signaling pathway could be different.
Can it be both genetic and trained? So if someone has experienced, like, I don't know, intense pain, they got set on fire, they were in a house, versus someone who's never experienced it hard, or someone's heard very loud noises and very
yes.
It can be both genetic. So again, I see super tasters. That's genetic.
That's genetic, yeah.
Right. Whereas some could theoretically be trained over time to become more
maybe not a super taster,
to
but
taste, or more sensitive to smell or sight or whatever.
Yeah. And as a general point, yes, there'd be limits in how much you could. It's limited by the hardware, but the hardware and the system that interprets it is adaptable. So going on to pain, which is its own sense. I want to talk about. I'm not going to go into any of these in any detail, but this is a table of receptors that do transduction. So they turn an environmental stimulus into a change in the electrical activity of a cell for touch and heat. The Nobel Prize, I want to say I forget which one, but this year the Nobel Prize was awarded to the scientist who first discovered that there are touch and heat receptors, and that there is a gene for it for each one of these. So each one of these is an individual protein. There is a gene, and if you have variations in this gene, then the function of that protein will be different. But just as a way, as for a point of just showing the scale of this thing, it's not like there is a touch receptor and a pain receptor. There are dozens of each. They vary by species. They're genetically different. But this is what they look like, or this is not what they look like. This is what they look like. So this is an example of what one looks like. This is a touch receptor. This is one that detects capsaicin. So if you're eating some cock sauce wings, that heat that comes with it is going to be detected by some variant of this receptor. And the interesting thing is that whether a cell expresses, say, this receptor or that receptor is genetically controlled. So you have the nerve cell that is either going to be a touch cell, a light touch, a vibration cell, something that detects cold, something that detects heat. These are all parallel lines of senses. They're mixed sometimes in upstream processing, but what's called the primary perception of the sense, the initial transduction. Does this cell respond to heat, or does it respond to touch, or does it respond to cold? That's determined by whether or not it's expressing receptor set A, receptor set B, and that's in the genetically determined in the development of the cell. So with pain, there's identified transductive mechanisms are distinct for acids, heat, and capsaicin. So the same receptor can respond to a hot chili pepper as well as an actual increase in temperature, cold, or pressure. And there's a bunch of subtypes for pressure, like intense pressure versus like vibration, light touch. They have more or less responsiveness to different kinds of stimulation. Just like in the eye, some of the proteins will be more or less responsive to certain wavelengths of light. These are in pain. The signals the receptors will be more sensitive if there's inflammation. So this is an example of what's called. Like you say, it's the same terminal. There's some in a normal condition. There's, say, a receptor is cold. If it's cold, the receptor is closed. There's no information coming through. If there's heat or capsaicin, some information comes in, or it depolarizes the cell. If the tissue is inflamed, then under normal condition, resting condition, it can passively allow depolarization. Think about if you get a sunburn. You don't need additional heat or touch to feel the heat of the burn. That's this. But then if you go and take a hot shower, if somebody slaps you on the back when you have a sunburn, it's an amplified response. Okay, inflammation modulates the system. Now, so far we talked about the transition of an energy in the environment into the electrical impulses of the nervous system. That's occurring mostly. It's going to be occurring out here in the periphery. So if you look at the nervous system, it's got your brain, your spinal cord, and then all those nerves going out and innervating, like we'll say primarily your skin for touch and pain, and that information is brought back into the nervous system to inform behavior. And that's where I'm going to start. This is where we're going to shift into why we have pain. So what is pain? Pain is to summarize so far, the sensory perception is of things like heat, extreme touch, extreme heat and extreme touch will trigger a action potential in a sensory neuron that tells your brain that this kind of sensory information has entered the domain of the skin that cell is responsible for. It is not the same as vision. That same cell is blind to the world of light. It's blind to sound. It is blind to, say, light touch if it is one that only responds to heat at a temperature of 115 degrees. That's, for example, for the capsaicin receptor. It's like if you have temperature of heat that's about 115, which is about where you would start to have tissue damage. Not coincidentally, this is where my argument is going to hang, that this is actually a sense that is, it comports with common sense. Pain exists to protect you. If you have a temperature that will damage the tissue, then you have a specialized system to tell your nervous system about that. What happens when your nervous system knows about that? Good question. So you don't even need a brain to protect the tissue, because you've got this thing called well, you have reflex loops, various kinds. This is called a withdrawal reflex. You put your hand on a hot stove. You can do this with a spinalized animal. So these experiments have been done. You just remove the brain. You don't need any sort of subjective consciousness, some relationship with your feelings. There's no psychology necessary. There's a loop between the nociceptor, the thing that detects potentially damaging stimulus, and the motor neuron that causes flexion. You just step on a nail, withdrawal is 1 synapse away, maybe 2, depending on which part of the withdrawal we're talking about. Another reflex loop, contralateral extension. So step on a nail. Not only do you withdraw, so you step on the nail, withdraw here. Also, there's a reflex loop to extend the contralateral side. So you will, again, you don't need a brain. This is just the nociceptor fires, and the thing is remove your tissue from the thing that's doing this. That's the first. That's 1 synapse away from the sensory experience. You don't need a brain for this either. What happens when you have a inflammation in the tissue? So you get like a puncture wound in this example. Not only does the neuron bring information into your spinal cord, it has collaterals that go back out and release inflammatory agents into the tissue area affected. So the sensory neuron itself can produce inflammation as a response to have the immune system come in and to sensitize further touch to the area. Again, to drive the pain system further. It will self-reinforce while driving an immune response. After this, it goes up to the brain. I'm going to stick to spinal cord and out, because once we get to the brain, it gets way more complicated. But just so we have some kind of completeness, and you can connect this to when you're reading a paper, when you're hearing somebody philosophize about this, this is how you get to there. So the spinal cord neuron projects up to the thalamus and other places, but this is one of the main pathways for pain and for touch. Any questions so far about like just the neuroanatomy stuff? Yeah.
Are there reflexes that do require the brain?
By definition, a reflex doesn't.
Okay.
So it's like definitionally doesn't.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
Yeah.
Can the brain override reflex?
Yes. So the brain has descending projections that will inhibit or prime the reflex. Yeah. So an example is like if you got a hot plate, a hot dish. If it's just you in your kitchen, you might like reflexively drop it. If you have a very important date at your house, you will probably tough it out.
And that's not a conscious decision either, because it doesn't happen in time.
No. It's just your subconscious parts of your brain know that like do not fuck this up.
This is lower in the hierarchy of
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
But you can't override the inflammation.
I don't know about that. I bet if you like maybe was that guy at Wim Hof? Yes. I bet like some baller like that. Like people can apparently do that. It's just very hard. Because the part of your brain that's thinking, I would like to override inflammation, I would like to change my relationship with sensory experience, that's way the fuck up here. That self-conscious, aware part is trying to influence stuff that's many synapses away. And it's just, I just think it gets harder and harder the farther away it is from this thing. Because that's the thing that's making that decision. It's one part of the brain trying to influence other parts of the nervous system.
It's like the ice bath. You get in the ice bath and you're like, get out. And you're like, I'm not going to.
Yes.
Don't, no, right? And at first you're like, well, I last 7 seconds. The next time you last 40 seconds. And eventually you're like, no, I can do this for 11 minutes.
But if there's a hot girl, you'll instantly last 11 minutes.
Yes.
Or 3 minutes.
Or 3, yeah, there you go. Okay, so why do we have pain? So I'm gonna make this is my position. You have it as a warning device that tissue damage could occur, and as a recuperative healing mechanism once damage has occurred. So evidence for this, we have specialized transduction machinery to drive a withdrawal reflex, like we just talked about. This is it's also that this transduction machinery, the kinds of things that it transduces are the kinds of things that damage tissue, such as having been puncture wounded, having your hand on something that will burn you. Is a specialized system that removes the tissue from the thing. Another point. It also drives an inflammatory response. So it is trying to protect the tissue which may have been breached by a biological or a bacterial or virus pathogen. So the nociceptive response also triggers an immune response to the injured tissue site, which further sensitizes the nociceptive responses in that area to encourage disuse. You hurt your arm. Do you want to go push as hard with that arm after it's injured? No, because there's a system in your biology that biases you toward that. Your dog hurts its leg. You will see it favors it takes the weight off the leg until it slowly adds it back on. It takes until it's healed. Okay, it takes about as long as the tissue takes to heal. The problem is when the tissue is healed and the system is still sensitized, then you have chronic pain. I put this as an example as this girl had injured her hand. This is weeks later after the acute injury phase was done, and she had chronic allodynia down her entire arm. So that she had, allodynia is the perception of touch as pain. So it's one of the phenomena of chronic pain, when something that was like, the touch, this feeling of fabric on your skin, the wind, whatever, is perceived as either a very intense, pressure that's like to the degree where you would want to remove your hand from a nail or your foot from the nail, or as heat. So this girl in particular perceived, she's a high schooler, or on her arm, don't touch, because people if they just accidentally touched her a backpack or something like that in school, it would be perceived like it was a torch, as though there was a flame on her skin. And you can see, that's the one thing I thought was interesting, is her arm looks super inflamed. This is a month after whatever, it was some minor sprain or something like that, but there was this massive allodenic loop happening with her. I just wanted to add that as an example. Two more things. So another piece of evidence that is that there is goes more into the brain, but that after a painful experience, that system that transduces dangerous physical stimuli drives behavior to avoid those things in the future. And also in the presence of ongoing stimulation of those systems, the pain perception systems, it will drive behavior, what's called a sickness response. Basically, you're a deer who gets shot. Your impulse is to go back to your den and chill. You get hurt, you're less likely to want to go out to the club. You're going to want to hang out at home and watch Netflix. This is a behavioral drive from pain signaling. Now, one of the problems with people who have chronic pain is that they withdraw socially and isolate themselves, and it can be a compounding cycle of misery because they're parts of their brain that are dictating the proper behaviors to do when you're sick are being driven in the absence of any actual acute danger in their life. Another piece. I think this is probably the best piece of evidence for the primary functions of pain are to protect from potential damage and to encourage disuse to heal damaged tissue. There's actually an experiment that's been done by nature where people are congenitally insensitive to pain. So they don't have the genes that transduce nociceptive stimulus are mutated, and they cannot perceive pain. So here are some kids that have this situation. So this is typical. These are not. This is like the typical condition. This is not like a cherry-picked thing. This girl's name is Gabby. She has a fake eye because she poked it out. She's missing almost all of her teeth because she had kept bumping into things and had never calibrated through her development that was not good. So there's just this person had no problem with this. They come into the hospital and it's like, oh, does this feel bad? No. They had this ongoing infection and never stopped to think that they might need to address it. Anyways, this phenotype, this is not a usual hip of a 7-year-old.
It's a broken femur? What is that?
Which one?
At the right of the one that looks like the femur is like the acetabular, the head.
This guy?
No, the femoral head up here in the middle. The one you were just pointing at. Middle.
Oh yeah, no, their hips look like cauliflower. Like, yeah, no, their hips are going to be arthritic by the age, by their.
It just turns sideways.
Yeah, no, I think they already have a
There's an
implant.
There's an implant.
Yes. Yes.
There's been an ORIF.
Okay.
So this kid, you can't see here, but his fingers are severely fucked up. His hands. But these are just children that don't have. It's not like they're dumb. They just cannot perceive pain. So the counterfactual is like, what happens if you don't have pain? The average, like usually they're going to be dead by their early 20s. So you're going to rapidly accumulate injuries to your tissue until you die. I think the best example of like why do we have pain? It's like, oh well, people who don't have it accumulate damage to tissue and die, and that combined with the fact that the neurological wiring is to remove the tissue from the environment that causes the signaling. I think it's a good argument for why we have pain. Are there any questions about that? Yeah.
So you mentioned the hardware-software issue. I mean, we know sometimes, or we often want the lifter to operate through a pain of a 1 or 2 out of 10, and continue moving in order to stay functional, or a social environment recontextualizes
Sure.
pain.
Yes.
So it makes perfect intuitive sense to me that the hardware is designed to prevent tissue damage and recovery healing. So how is there a nervous explanation for social modification of pain, and does that change how you coach or how you interpret the pain signal? Because I see all these arguments where, oh, we have to figure out whether or not this pain is real or not. And I'm like, how am I supposed to tell someone your pain isn't really pain? There's no...
Yeah, it's very hard.
Pain is always real, right?
Yeah. If you experience it, it's real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question is whether it correlates with actual tissue damage.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, the
And when to tell people to push through it, or push into it, lean into
yeah,
it.
the problem is that diagnosing the nature of pain is very hard and bad. Like the diagnostic tools and the interventions are common. It's somewhere between a dice roll. It's like no, I'm going to use you as an example. You had this pain issue in your back for 3 years. You've been to a bunch of different specialists and doctors. Every single time is a different diagnosis. And then the recommendation of, hey, I won't name who, but like you had the recommendation by a PT barbell trainer that, hey, because we don't understand pain, fuck it, just train through it, you'll be fine. And it just made it worse for you. This is because sometimes there's an actual fucking problem, and we're also bad at diagnosing it. So tread carefully. But as far as like social and psychological stuff, that's psychology. That's brain stuff. I don't want to comment without having.
Nervous because our brain, our psychology is a product of the nervous system.
Yes, it's one part of the nervous system interpreting information from another part, and that you can. There's some of that you can change by just how you have a relationship with the person, because that is changing their nervous system, because it's changing their mind, it's just how much leverage do you have? If you're Wim Hof, you can adjust your immunal tone some minor amount after 20 years of meditating in an ice bath. Whereas like it's very easy to control things like I want to pick up my coffee. Like that's a very easy control for this part of my brain to mitigate the action of my nervous system. But the other games are very hard. And that's so anyways, that's psychology. I'm going to defer. It's also psychology and medicine, but
is there something about the social or psychological aspect of it that changes the mechanics that you were just describing? Whether maybe it's like hormone levels, cortisol, inflammation.
Good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I would be inclined to think it's mostly localized into the brain, but that the sensory perception is going to be more or less the same. And if the sensory perception was changed, it's because the habits have changed that changed the tissue. But yeah.
Or you utilize like pharmacological, right? So
Hell yeah.
we can use opiates, we can use anti-inflammatories, steroidal and non-steroidal.
Sure.
And those have to be used with extreme caution, I assume, because again, if what I understand what you're saying is like, if your body's saying like, no, this hurts, and it actually hurts, and it's actually tissue damage. Like, well, what let's do is let's block the pain receptor. Let's remove the inflammation by using both steroidal and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Like, we're walking a fine line there.
I think in general, you can correct me, Sully, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's usually.
I have never believed that was a problem.
Yeah, I would
Like,
agree.
If you have ongoing tissue damage, Motrin is not going to keep you from hurting, right?
Yeah.
When you have ongoing tissue damage.
You're not going to turn into these kids.
Yeah, you can reduce the symptoms, which is fine. That's just palliative, but you're still going to hurt if you're using a damaged structure. I've
Yeah.
never believed that.
We don't turn into.
I think
No,
our biggest
I think
problem
the biggest
as
problem.
coaches is if you have somebody who's in a situation where a movement hurts, but isn't necessarily causing ongoing tissue damage, but you have movement avoidance because of pain, then you get into a situation where that movement can deteriorate to the point where they'll never really get it back. So you have a shoulder that hurts in the press, right? And the tissue damage is no longer ongoing, like you have a tweak, but you don't do this, well, you're going to quickly get to a point where you'll never do that again, right? Because you've got structural changes that you've allowed to happen because you didn't use that movement pattern. And that is a fine line, and I think that's part of the art of what we do, and that's a whole seminar, right there. So that's tough. I mean, how do you know when you've gone from ongoing tissue damage to simply a sort of subacute chronic pain kind of situation where you have to push the movement, where you have to push them through the pain to rescue the movement.
Yeah. And how do you know when you can't confidently say it? Because like that's what you want to do. I'm just using Noah again. It's like in the case where he was working with somebody and they were wrong. They were like, well, it's probably just the acute situation is probably dealt with, and you need to just like get in the habit of training and do these things. And it was just making it worse for a while.
I think at Grayscale we have a house physician. We have a sports medicine physician who understands what we do. We refer somebody to him, and he's, well, here's your problem. You're lifting all these heavy weights. Right? He's not like that.
He's speaking in the third person.
He's like,
It's really douchey when you do that.
right. So,
I am the house
but
medicine.
I can send like an 80-year-old woman to him with like, now she's hurting, like her butt hurts, all right, and she can't squat, and I send her to him. And he's like, well, let's see what we can do to get you back under the bar. Like, we have that guy, and cultivating those kinds of relationships can be invaluable because as a coach, I can't do that. I can't diagnose my clients, and I can't play doctor when I'm being a barbell coach. You understand what I'm saying? And
Totally.
so I think cultivating those kinds of relationships is really, really good, and that's another area where it's a little harder when you're an online coach.
Sure.
It's a little bit more difficult.
And clarify on your point or your question, I think that I agree with Sully where pain makes too many false positives. Or it's like usually the problem with pain, especially as people age, is they have an ongoing signal that is not really serving them any help, and you need to get around it or help reduce it. And that's like in what we do in the lab is chronic pain, how to make it stop.
Sure.
And that's because that's the problem. I think
Because it sort of turns into a superhighway, right? At some point, like it continues.
Perfectly
to
fine
just, like,
analogy.
More and more and
Yeah.
more superhighway, and so you're like, how do I put the roadblock up?
Yeah, yeah,
Which
Yeah.
is why
Yeah,
I'm
slow
a
the
really
traffic.
big booster for analgesics, right? That's why I
Like
think,
heroin.
well, yeah, sure. right?
Fentanyl.
I think
absolutely.
underusing analgesics in heat and cold and using the movement pattern and saying, hey, this movement pattern is not catastrophic.
Yeah.
And I got my Motrin and my Tylenol and I got my heat and my cold, right? So that the pain doesn't become a super high. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, pain pathways become super highways.
Yeah,
if-
central sensitization is the one of the mechanisms we would
Right,
say,
right.
the primary, sensory pathology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was what did you call it? Sensory.
Central sensitization. It's usually like basically there's sensory stuff that's in periphery, and then where it synapses and pushes information up the spinal cord to the brain. That region is highly plastic, and after intense pain, stimulus, tissue damage, and ongoing inflammation, it becomes highly sensitive, so that you have something like even a touch neuron firing. That signal gets passed on and mixed into the pathway to the brain that tells the brain there's a painful stimulus. That's one of the hypotheses. For the primary sensory pathology, that's not the same as like the psychological interpretation of it, which is going to be in the brain. Sorry, yeah.
So if we, let me think the right way to ask this. Are we more sensitive to perceptions of pain or pressure or heat or other things the less experience we have with them? And one of the ways to be able to better understand the full spectrum of where it's dangerous or where it isn't is by having more experience with it. Like an example that I can think of with heat is that our ancestors were not miserable being out in this heat all day. But for us, as soon as we step outside the air conditioning, we're miserable and we're dying,
Sure.
right? It's incredibly painful or it's at least uncomfortable. So is it the same type of thing where part of our sensitivity is from lack of exposure to the full spectrum that's within the healthy bounds, and so we see anything that's just outside of our normal range as dangerous?
I'm guessing, I'd say that makes sense. I'd say yes. I don't know at what level
So
the
one way
mechanism
to
of
explain
adaptation
it,
occurs.
essentially, is by exposing yourself to different levels of pressure or heat or other things, and kind of
I
gaining
don't
it
know.
and learning where the danger zones actually
Like
are.
some
Yeah,
sort
like
of,
tolerance.
some sort of,
Yeah, tolerance building.
like
Even
a,
when they
like
give
a
us-
voluntary hardship kind of.
Something like that, right?
I think it was Brazilian wax.
But actually, it's a perfect example, right? You think about, we all have the client who's been training for 2 months, who hits the first set of deadlifts, it gets really hard, and they start to pull, and they pull on it for 1 second, and they set it down, and they go, nope, coach, I couldn't do it. And I was like, wait a minute, 2 days ago, you did 5 pounds less for 5. How can you not do this for 1? Because they had the governor in their brain to go, this is gonna hurt you. It's the same reason we sit in a sauna, with guys sit in a sauna at 180 degrees, the first time you go in like 2 minutes, I'm out. And eventually you can go for 20 minutes, same thing with the ice bath, same thing with the thing. But like, you're not actually getting tissue damage, like true tissue damage probably at a sauna at 180 degrees for 20 minutes, or an ice bath for 10, or the heavy deadlift, right? But there is this thing, this governor in our brain that says like, man, I just want to go back to a 68-degree air-conditioned house and sit in the lazy boy. And you're like, anything outside of that is pain. I don't want to do that. But I mean, I think that's what voluntary hardship is pushing yourself into that, the old adage of get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And we did this with our daughters. We just hiked at 10,000 to 12,000 feet in Colorado. I'm like, I can't breathe. They're like, we gotta stop. And I was like, come on, you'll be fine. Like, I promise you, I need more oxygen. I've got more muscle cells that are like dying for oxygen than you. And you're like, I'm not gonna make it. You're gonna have to carry me out of here. I'm like, you're 12. You'll be fine.
This is the point in that Hercules story that Virtue makes. Says if you go with Vice, you're gonna need a really soft bed to sleep on. You're gonna need the lazy boy. You're gonna be soft, you know. And they actually, in that story, Socrates says there's a big difference between voluntary and involuntary hardship.
Yeah.
I'm making that up. It's
Yeah.
from the story.
Yeah.
And no one will remember your name, because nobody gets to remember. It's like, yeah, that guy chilled out a lot. You know?
Dude abides, dog.
There is a mental toughness aspect. People who are able to be refined by involuntary hardship is actually, I think there's some virtue in that. That's hard to do. but we're always refined by voluntary hardship, right? Like when we choose hard,
See,
we get better.
They're
But when hard
always
is
coming
thrust
back
upon
up.
us, a lot of people don't get any better. Most people don't get better.
Yeah, they break.
Most people don't get better when they go to prison. When but some people do, right? Viktor Frankl's like, I can find meaning in this. It's wild.
has your coaching changed at all around injury or pain since you've been studying it?
Probably, but more subtle. It's not like I have a PT practice.
All right.
Yeah, it's just I can understand. I mean, I can butcher the understanding of like a medical or PT diagnosis less now. But I mean, mostly what I do is it's like I'm in Lego land studying like how these circuits are modified at like molecular levels, and it's not as relevant to applied medicine. I mean, it's you want to translate it into a tool that people can use to do medicine, but the medicine's different.
It's like the synapses themselves. You're up here, the thing is down here. There's a lot of steps between what
Yes.
you're doing in the lab. And
Yeah, but it does help. I can because I can actually like kind of understand. I just understand stuff better, but it doesn't make me more of an expert in
Sure.
like how to do medicine.
All good? Thanks, dude.